Hello, class. So today we're going to talk especially about continuing revelation, and especially the second official declaration. You read and had a reading on Doctrine and Covenants section 138. You got to read it and discuss it on your dialogue. This later revelation of Joseph F. Smith about the spirit world, and so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. But just showing that continuing revelation is going on into the 20th century, right? And like many of the other revelations, it took years before that revelation that Joseph F. Smith had was canonized and placed into the Doctrine and Covenants as our final section. So the pattern even in Joseph's day was a revelation was received, recorded somewhere, referenced, talked about, and then usually years later, it would then be added to the canon of Scripture. Often people ask, well, are we ever going to add any more revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants? I hope so. My guess is at some point, yes. I mean, almost every edition of the Doctrine and Covenants has added portions to it. In our last edition, there were many changes made to the section headings, and very substantial introductions were added to the first and second official declarations. But the text itself it wasn't changed, and the sections weren't changed. But could that happen in the future? Absolutely, it's entirely possible that happens. But I want to talk about this. This is obviously a very difficult topic. The need behind Official Declaration 2. To start off with, Official Declaration 1, ending plural marriage, at least ending new plural marriages. Of course, plural marriages continue to be practiced into the 20th century. And Official Declaration 2 are different for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons don't seem readily apparent, but hopefully they will as you've done your studying. First, Official Declaration 1 ended plural marriage. Plural marriage had a revelation that had been given by God beginning the practice. You have D&C 132 in front of you, and in fact, Joseph has known by revelation through multiple communications with God that he is to begin teaching this as early as 1831, a year after the church is founded. He just doesn't. He resists it, as you read. And when it's instituted, yes, it is very hard, but it's instituted prophetically and using D&C 132 as a basis. It's not across the board. Not everyone has to live in a polygamous marriage. In fact, very few people relatively are going to live in a polygamous marriage. There are going to be thousands, tens of thousands of people who do. But it will never be the majority or even approach the majority of the church. What was required was that you believed that it was a revelation from God, that Joseph was a prophet when he received it, despite the difficulty of that revelation. There were certainly apostate groups who said, no, actually, it's not really a real revelation. So, I mean, you can see why that would be an issue. With Official Declaration 1, not only is it started with a revelation, it's ended with a revelation. You have Wilford Woodruff receiving a revelation declaring that plural marriages were to no longer be made, at least in the United States, and then that is expanded in the early 20th century to what's often sometimes called the Second Manifesto, where even in places like Canada and in Mexico, where they could still perform these plural marriages without threat of legal problems, that God had then taken it from the earth for new plural marriages. So you have a revelation beginning it and a revelation ending it. When Official Declaration 1 is read in conference, when that is first announced, it is incredibly difficult for the saints to accept. Again, what you want to think is, well, of course they all hated plural marriage, and so of course they all jumped up and down when this happened, and it's just not the case. People are shocked. They're stunned. Many of them have come to believe that plural marriage was their Abrahamic test. Now, again, not everyone was practicing it, but whether you were practicing it or not, it was how people had come to judge you and your religion. In much the same way, the word of wisdom is kind of a way to mark us today, right? I mean, it's very difficult to mark, to judge exactly whether or not someone's following the commandments of the church, but you have a pretty good idea if someone is, drunk in front of you, whatever their belief might be. I mean, we're all sinners. They probably aren't the most stalwart in following their baptismal covenants at that moment, right? In much the same way, the reverence of the plural marriage revelation, the willingness to defend it even though people were angry about it, even though they're being persecuted, was in a way taken as this Abrahamic test for people. I know this is hard, but I'm going to believe it anyway. Our generation, your generation, experiences something in a much more minor way because it's not legal. People aren't going to jail over it. But societally, you will probably start to find all the more so that the church's position on gay marriage today increasingly ostracizes members of the church, especially young members of the church, from their friends and coworkers that they interact with. As that becomes far more acceptable in the world, and the opponents of it, or those who don't accept or perform gay marriages, are viewed as being bigoted or hate-filled, it will become increasingly more difficult for members of the church to stand up and say, I know that this is a teaching from God. Nothing is quite a parallel to this, right? Because this is a section declaring that they're supposed to teach it, D&C 132. It's reiterated by prophet after prophet after prophet. And then all of a sudden, it's gone. Almost as it were overnight. Not immediately when it's made illegal, but 30 years later, after thousands of people have suffered. And then again, what if you're already in a plural marriage? If you're in a plural marriage as a man or a woman, or a child of a plural marriage, does the fact that it's now rescinded mean that somehow it was less virtuous, that it was less righteous? If you look at the New Relief Society manual, in fact, one of the earliest lessons is a discussion about how difficult it was for women in the Relief Society to accept this revelation ending plural marriage came from God. Again, to us, we're saying, of course they didn't have a problem with it. But that's because you're coming at it from a culture that has always wanted to avoid it, not think about it, and not even want to have to explain it, want to forget about it. They're coming at it from a generation of seeing their acceptance of this hated doctrine as evidence of their faith. Now, I said it's very different from Official Declaration 2. Official Declaration 2, you do not have a revelation that begins the practice. You don't have something that is a revelation where God says, I now declare men of African descent can no longer have the priesthood. You do have a revelation ending it. And unlike Official Declaration 1, which was doubted, which was wondered about, many people wondered if it would be reversed in the years to come. I was reading Heber J. Grant's journal, and while he's on as an apostle, he's on in the early 1900s, he's visiting saints up in Montana. He has multiple women come to him and say, when are they going to allow us to start practicing plural marriage again? There are no men here that are priesthood holders that are worthy for us to marry. We can't get married now. Are you going to change the policy? Again, to us today, we say, well, that's unfathomable. No one would ever say that. Well, according to his journal, these women did. So there's a great deal of consternation. There's a reason why you have those explanations about Official Declaration 1. Wilford Woodruff explaining to these congregations, saying, look, if we didn't do it, the church was going to be destroyed over it. You don't have that for Official Declaration 2. Are there some people who are stunned, surprised, have a hard time understanding? Yes, but by and large, you have this outpouring of emotion as people are so grateful that it happened. This is something that people have been looking forward to for years. Now, not universally. Of course, there are some people that actually will leave the church over this. There are certain apostate groups that form, small ones, but form precisely on the basis that no, the priesthood should never have been given to members of the Church of African descent. But on BYU's campus, for instance, people flood out into the halls, into the promenade, cheering and shouting and singing. It is a rejoicing moment. You talk to almost anyone from the era, talk to your grandparents, very few will say, and I was really mad about this. And we'll actually listen to some witnesses who talk about this, who will even say that, there were so many people that are excited about it. So there is a very big difference there. As the essay you read, and I'm assuming you've read the essay, if you haven't, you may want to go read it before we continue on this. The leaders of the church felt like that they needed to have a revelation from God to extend the priesthood to all worthy males, including those of African descent. This also includes the blessings of the temple, by the way, the endowment to men and women of African descent. So this does not just only affect men. This affects women too. It's important to understand that. It affects women. Now, are they told that therefore they cannot be saved? You can't get it? No, they're told the opposite. They're told that they have every bit the same access to the celestial kingdom, but God has not granted, has not yet given them the revelation saying they can have the priesthood. It's a very difficult thing, especially in our day. I mean, the way to win essentially any argument in our day is to call someone a racist, right? That's the way of winning. You can say that no matter what, they're not a virtuous person because of it. So how do we deal with a policy which is by definition a racist policy, right? You couldn't, by virtue of your racial origin, hold the priesthood. And that's why it's so difficult for us to process today. I want to reiterate what the church's statements on this are. Race and the church, all are alike unto God. The gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone. The Book of Mormon states that black and white, bond and free, male and female, all are alike unto God. This is the church's official teaching. People of all races have always been welcomed and baptized into the church since its beginning. In fact, by the end of his life in 1844, Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, opposed slavery. This is an important thing here, that unlike, if you remember earlier in the semester, unlike other Protestant churches, Mormons always welcomed and baptized blacks into the church, and their willingness to baptize former slaves or freed persons into the church is one of the driving causes of the violence that breaks out in Missouri. So in many ways, they're on the leading edge of race relations when it comes to joining the church. There's never a time when blacks are denied church membership. There's never a time when they are deemed as being not worthy of exaltation, right? So that's important to understand. And Joseph Smith is going to be called out as a radical. He's going to be branded an abolitionist. The word abolitionist is a hated term in the 1840s. If you wanted to insult someone, you called them an abolitionist. And because he opens his presidential platform, instead of talking about the tariff or arguing about the national bank, which is what everyone else wanted to argue, he opens it up by talking about how we claim we're a nation of freedom while there are millions of our brothers and sisters who are held in chains. Only because the skin that covers their spirit is a darker shade than ours. It is a taboo topic in the 1840s. The previous presidential election, the election 1840, the primary topic was the national bank and the tariff. The 1836 election, the economy and the tariff. The two leading candidates for the 1844 candidacy, the Democrat who's going to be elected is James K. Polk, an owner of slaves from Tennessee, and Henry Clay, an owner of slaves from Kentucky. Slavery was only a peripheral issue and one that it had been agreed upon to not discuss. So the fact that Joseph took this very strong stance against slavery branded him as an abolitionist, and people attacked him for his position. So it's important to know. During this time, some black males were ordained to the priesthood. At some point, the church stopped ordaining male members of African descent, although there were a few exceptions. Important to understand also, this was never a universal rule, in the sense that there was always some black member of the church who actually did hold the priesthood. Now, whether someone might come back and say later, well, that's an error or whatever, the reality is there were always black men in the church, very few, but some that held the priesthood nevertheless. It is not known precisely why, how, or when this restriction began in the church, but it has ended. Church leaders sought divine guidance regarding the issue, and more than 3 decades ago extended the priesthood to all worthy male members. The church immediately began ordaining members of the priesthood offices wherever they attended throughout the world. And that's true. They immediately began giving it. The fact that we don't know where it originates, even in the essay that you read, what do we know? We know that in 1852, Brigham Young, as they're debating the topic of slavery. Now keep in mind, for a Mormon, slavery is a difficult concept to think about, because why would God allow an entire race of people to be subjugated the way they were? It's very difficult. If you're a Calvinist, you might just say to yourself, well, God never intended to save most people. And of course, he never intended to save slaves. So, yeah, I mean, he never intended to save most of Europe. He never intended to save all of America. He didn't intend to save Asia. So that Africans are degraded in the slavery era, that they're treated badly, that they're enslaved. I'm not saying a Calvinist would embrace and say, oh, I'm so glad that happened, although some do. But it's also not a huge moral crisis for them. They already believe that almost everyone living on earth deserves to burn in hell and will burn in hell. The fact that someone has a slightly worse life in this life rather than someone else, it can all be chalked up to the fact that, well, they aren't saved. And so, of course, as unsaved people, they have great difficulties. The church unequivocally condemns racism, including any and all past racism by individuals both inside and outside the church. So notice that. They unequivocally condemn it, including any and all past racism by individuals both inside and outside the church. In 2006, then President Gordon B. Hinckley declared that no man who makes disparaging remarks concerning those of another race can consider himself a true disciple of Christ, nor can he consider himself to be in harmony with the teachings of the church. Let us all recognize that each of us is a son or daughter of our Heavenly Father who loves his children. Recently, the church has made the following statement on the subject. The origins of priesthood availability are not entirely clear. Some explanations with respect to this matter were made in the absence of direct revelation, and references to these explanations are sometimes cited in publications. These previous personal statements do not represent church doctrine. And that's really a lot of what we're talking about here. As they sought to try to explain the priesthood ban, the exclusion, people developed multiple different theories as to why they thought it was the case. They were well-reasoned in some cases. In some cases, they were terribly reasoned, but at least they were reasons that they thought reflected the reason why. The church today rejects those reasonings. So could you be in a gospel doctrine class, or a high priest group or relief society where someone says, well, actually, it's because of the curse of Cain, and someone starts explaining that? Of course, right? There are people who made those explanations. The church is rejecting those explanations. We do not believe that. So the question is, why? Why did anyone believe it? That requires us to go through a little bit more history. Brigham Young in 1852 is not saying, I declare today from henceforth and forever that no blacks will ever hold the priesthood. In Brigham Young's time, he acknowledges that multiple black men who'd been ordained in Illinois did in fact hold the priesthood and refers to them as elders. He's instead making a statement as an explanation. This announcement, he's not announcing from henceforth and forever no black will hold the priesthood. He's instead saying, this is why. He gives an explanation. And the explanation that he gives is exactly the type of explanation that is given all throughout the 19th century and beyond. Sometimes we think the idea that black men and women held the curse of Cain, that they were marked by God, that they were descended from Ham. Sometimes we take that to be a Mormon doctrine, an idea originating from Mormons. The reality is that, in fact, it is something that predates Mormonism by nearly a millennia. That's important to understand. If you were to ask an American who wasn't a Mormon in the 1850s why it is that blacks seem to be a cursed race, that they are subject to slavery, the response would be, well, because they're descended from Canaan, and Canaan was cursed by It was from Ham, and Ham was cursed by his father Noah, and that's the reason why they're enslaved. It was not a Mormon belief. It was an American belief. Now, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time with you to help you understand that Americans believed an awful lot of things that were ridiculous, wrong, and stupid in our comparison. And this is a racist belief. You can't argue this wasn't racism. By definition, it was racist. Of course, they lived in a society that was very different from the one that we live in now. That doesn't mitigate the fact that people were still persecuted and treated horribly for their race. If you were a black man or woman living in the United States in the 1850s, you were treated terribly, even in places where slavery was outlawed. The state of California, for instance, its constitution in 1850 comes into the Union as a free state, but also bars all blacks from entering their state regardless. Free slave doesn't matter. There will be no blacks in our state. Right? So it's an era of not just rampant personal and social racism, but legalized, enshrined, expected racism at state, local, and national levels. As difficult as it is for us to think about, our church leaders in those eras, they came to the gospel with these false racial ideologies with them until they were taught differently. The same way they thought that hell absolutely existed until God gave a revelation saying that it didn't. The same way they thought that marriage was for this life only until God gave a revelation saying that it didn't. The same way they thought that you absolutely had to accept Jesus in this life in order to be saved until they learned differently. It's only this one offends us more because many of us have black friends, men and women who we love, and we see how difficult and horrific it must be, and we want so desperately to not see that kind of inequality that we want to believe that those who came into the church back in the day, that they had the same enlightened racial views that we do today. And they just didn't. There is no way to get around that. Because they were Americans or Western Europeans. And that's why I have what I have up on the screen for you here. This is the earliest anti-slavery pamphlet published in the New World. In the colonial North America. You can see down there it's published in 1700 in the colony of Massachusetts. It's published by a man by the name of Samuel Sewall. Samuel Sewall is he's actually a little bit notorious in American history because he's one of the judges at the Salem witch trials, which, my bad, right? For the rest of his life, though, he really devotes himself to trying to rid Massachusetts colony itself, primarily, of slavery. Again, you think usually of Massachusetts being a free state. Well, Massachusetts had slavery until the American Revolution. I mean, it's not, it's something that's practiced for 100 years after this is given. Sewall's point in writing this is he's arguing against slavery, and he's using the comparison of Joseph that was sold into slavery to Egypt as why we can't also participate in the slave trade. In doing so, he knows that slavery is almost universally accepted, especially by the Christians that he's talking to. The Christians believe, well, these slaves, if they stay in Africa, they're going to burn in hell forever because they don't have faith in Christ. At least by coming here, they have the opportunity to have faith. But he also knows the primary justification he's going to address actually right here. The primary justification, written as this objection. He knows that people are going to object to his argument that slaves should be freed. And this is, he's responding to, that the blackamoors are of the posterity of Ham, and are therefore under the curse of slavery. So he knows that the primary argument for the justification of slavery is that blacks are descended from Ham and therefore are under the curse of slavery by God. This is how Christians in America justified the inhumane and horrific practice of slavery. And not just the way slavery is practiced in America. I mean, millions of slaves are going to be worked to death, especially all throughout the New World. As inhumane as American slavery is in North America, in American slavery, the whippings and the beatings and the separation of family and the rapes of slave women, just the sheer brutality of slavery in America, as horrific as it is, it is actually the only place in the New World that had a natural population growth of slaves. Because in the rest of the New World, when slaves were working in silver mines, but primarily on sugar plantations in Jamaica or Barbados, they are literally worked to death. The commodity that they're extracting is worth so much that it is actually more valuable to a owner to work a slave without rest until they die than it is to give them breaks. The average life expectancy of a slave in colonial Barbados, a sugar island, sugar plantations are incredibly labor intensive and horrific. Sugar is incredibly valuable, though. The most valuable commodity there is. The average life expectancy for an adult male slave, so they're brought from Africa as an adult, after they arrive in Barbados is less than 7 years. There is literally no natural slave population increase. The great unknown Holocaust, I mean, it is known, of course, to historians, but for most people in the world, is the sheer millions of men and women who are worked to death, die of disease in horrific conditions for the 3 centuries that slavery dominates North and South America. It's horrific. In the New World, in North America, in the North American British colonies, there's still widespread acceptance of it. Slaves aren't generally worked to death because there's not a commodity that's valuable enough. Slaves are really expensive. Again, we think of slaves as being, people want them for free labor. It's about labor control. It's about the fact that no one's willing to work on your sugar plantation. Not because it's cheap. The average price of a slave is sometimes 2 or 3 times someone's annual income. By the time of the Civil War, it was not unheard of for an adult male slave to cost $1,000 at a time when the average person made $300 a year. To put that in our terms, that would mean the slave would cost somewhere around $180,000 to $250,000 each slave. So slavery is incredibly expensive, and that's not counting the upkeep. I mean, it's a lot cheaper, honestly, to just hire a poor Irish immigrant and pay them nothing. And then you're not concerned about their welfare or their health care or their living conditions or their clothes or anything like that. But if you invest a healthy amount of money, then you do care. So the primary justification was being made by these Christians in Massachusetts as early as 1700, as Samuel Sewall recognizes, is that this idea that they're under the curse of slavery. God says they're cursed. I'm not making them a slave. God says a servant of servants he'll be. God says that, not me. I'm just doing what God says. I'm actually a good Christian enslaving these people. This is what God told me to do. So it's not a Mormon belief, this idea of this curse. It is a cultural belief that exists at least as early as the Middle Ages in Europe. It's transferred to America, and then as slavery becomes more and more widespread because it's more and more lucrative, this justification is always one of the primary justifications all the way up to the American Civil War. Southern Baptists are going to split from the Northern Baptist Convention, particularly on the point that they believe the Bible and God commands, not just is okay with slavery, commands slavery. And so Mormons, coming into the church in the 1830s and 1840s, they are not immune to the false cultural beliefs of their day. In some cases, these cultural beliefs we laugh at, right? So, for instance, Joseph Smith wrote in his journal that the way to cure cholera was to quickly throw yourself in the river once you felt a fever come on. Now, not only will that not cure cholera, you actually probably got cholera from the river. So he honestly couldn't have been more wrong. But he wrote it into his journal. Why did Joseph Smith think that? He thought it because there were doctors, these herbalist doctors by the name of Thomsonian medical doctors, who believed and wrote widely that all disease was caused by your body becoming either too hot or too cold. In the case of cholera, you had cholera because you had a fever, not the other way around. Your fever was cholera. So how do you get rid of it? You go throw yourself into a cold river, right? Now, we laugh at that. We're probably laughing right now. It seems idiotic to us, right? But they had no understanding of medical science the way we do. Before you get too high on your horse, just think that 150, 200 years from now, people Students just like yourselves will look at us, will look at you, and think that we're idiots. They'll say things like, can you believe that when people had cancer, they used to shove radioactive material inside of them to cure it? Why didn't they just, whatever the cure for cancer is 200 years from now? But we're not idiots. We are a part of the culture and technology that exists at our time. And we can't avoid that. So Mormons were certainly susceptible to the racial theories of the day. Racial theories were bandied about all the time. During Joseph Smith's time, there was a very strenuously held racial theory that argued that, in fact, blacks were a separate species. This is during the time of Charles Darwin, so it was a little after Joseph Smith, when the idea of evolution started to become all the rage in America in explaining the origin of species. There were many who argued that there were actually two different deuterogenesis, a second Genesis, that in fact blacks didn't descend from Adam and Eve at all. So-called scientists believe that you could measure that blacks had less intelligence than whites by measuring the shape of their heads. I mean, the idea that blacks were somehow degraded and less possible of civilization and intelligence than whites was almost universally accepted in America and almost universally wrong, right? But that's how people justify, not almost universally wrong, totally wrong, but what I mean is almost no one recognized how wrong that was. There were some abolitionists that argued for the absolute equality of blacks and whites. Unfortunately, they are too few and far between. We know that black men and women are baptized into the church from the earliest days. In fact, there are abolitionist newspapers, Christian abolitionist newspapers, who, of course, hate Mormons for the same reason they hate slavery, that say there are too many blacks running out and joining this Mormon delusion, right? So we know that there are certainly black men and women joining the church, and there's no distinction made in most cases on their membership rolls on whether they're black or white. So we actually can't tell in many cases whether or not they're black or white. But this argument is an American one, that blacks are somehow maybe biologically different, that they're cursed by God. That explains. And again, the curse of God is something that people want to believe. Why? Well, now I don't have to feel like God is this terribly unfair person. Oh, of course blacks are treated horribly. That's because they were cursed by God. And you feel like you've made a nice, tidy knowledge of it. And it is something that is believed clearly by other people in Joseph Smith's era and with church leaders themselves. Official Declaration 2, of course, refutes this, changes the policy. After 1852, when Brigham Young explains the policy, it's honestly something that's not revisited very often. Why is it not revisited very often? Well, there are very, very, very few blacks living in Utah Territory. By 1850, there's fewer than 50 in Utah Territory, and many of them aren't living with the saints. Some are living in Nevada, although there are some that have been brought there as slaves by members of the church. Many Southern converts brought with them their slaves that were part of their household, and slavery was made legal by the Compromise of 1850 in Utah. And so, because there are very few black members of the church in Utah, the question does not get asked very often about whether or not priesthood should be extended. In the latter half of the 19th century, that question starts to get asked more and more. Women like Jane Manning James is going to ask if she has the ability to go to the temple. An inquiry is going to be made about whether or not she can, and the result being, no, we don't believe so, right? That she'll have to wait. At the same time, Brigham Young declared that there was this ban and explained it in the common racial terms of the day. He also stated that there would come a time when blacks would have all the priesthood, all the blessings of the priesthood and more. And I'm not even sure what "and more" means, right? But clearly he believed that this was not going to be something that was permanent. But it had been in place for so long that once the church started proselyting in places where there were many more African Americans or Africans in Africa or in Brazilians of African descent, the question started to be raised more and more and more. The policy was refined to the point of it had to be someone of African descent, right? So black men and women from Java, for instance, or Pacific Islander, they were always allowed to have the priesthood because it wasn't deemed that they were of African descent. In today's understanding of DNA, right, where everyone has DNA that traces them somewhere back to Africa at some degree, obviously they hadn't developed DNA that way. This is based purely upon family history, right, and how someone looked. They begin to ask the question more and more and more. David O. McKay contemplates it, thinks about it, prays about it, but doesn't feel as though he's received an answer to change the policy. And it's not until 1978 with President Kimball that they received that. Elder Oaks, talking about the priesthood ban, explains that if we read the scriptures with this question in mind, why did the Lord command this, or why did he command that? You'll find that in less than 1 in 100 commands there's any reason given. It's not the pattern of the Lord to give reasons. We can put reason to revelation, we can put reason to commandments, and when we do, we're on our own. Some people put reasons to the one we're talking about here, and they turned out to be spectacularly wrong. There's a lesson in that. The lesson I've drawn from that, I've decided a long time ago that I had faith in the command and I had no faith in the reasons behind it that had been suggested for it. I'm referring to the reasons given by general authorities and reasons elaborated upon by others. The reasons turned out to be man-made to a great extent. People looking for a way to explain this priesthood ban ended up just projecting their own cultural values. And as Elder Oaks said, they were man-made reasons to an extent. President Kimball, who's going to rescind the ban, he's going to be the prophet receiving the revelation. You can notice the date on this in 1963, so 15 years before the ban. You can tell he's already thinking about it, asked a question about it. He says, admittedly, our direct and positive information is limited. I have wished the Lord had given us more clarity on the matter. At the time, he didn't know whether to characterize the decision as a doctrine or as a policy, but acknowledged it had not varied in my memory. I knew that it could. I knew the Lord could change the policy and release the ban and forgive the possible error which brought about the deprivation. If the time comes, that he will do, I'm sure. So 15 years earlier, President Kimball was already thinking about, what if, we don't have a revelation declaring that the ban is in place. What if there never should have been one in place? What if we're just waiting for God to give us the revelation? And he's already thinking about it 15 years earlier. Later, he's going to explain how he received this revelation. I went to the temple alone day after day, and especially on Sundays and Saturdays when there were no organizations in the temple, when I could have it alone. This went on for some time as I was searching because I wanted to be sure. I had a great deal to fight, of course, myself largely, because I had grown up with the thought that Negroes should not have the priesthood, and I was prepared to go all the rest of my life until my death and defend it as it was. But this revelation assurance came to me so clearly that there was no question about it. What a humble statement for the prophet of God to make. That one of the biggest things he had to overcome was himself. Because this is how it had always been taught to him. And so he had to overcome the same way Brigham Young did. He had always been taught that hell existed, and that's why he couldn't immediately accept the vision. Here, President Benson had always been taught blacks were under the curse of Cain through Ham, that's why they couldn't have the priesthood in this life, that maybe they would at some point in the future, but right now they can't. And he's admitting here that he was affected by the things he was taught to. What an amazing admission by the prophet of God, that some of his beliefs were erroneous and not based upon direct revelation. But when the revelation did come, he, of course, embraced it and accepted it. There's another explanation he gives of how that revelation came. We had a glorious experience of having the Lord indicate clearly that the time had come when all worthy men and women everywhere can be fellow heirs and partakers of the full blessings of the gospel. I want you to know, as a special witness of the Savior, how close I have felt to him and to our Heavenly Father, as I have made numerous visits to the upper rooms of the temple, going on some days several times by myself. The Lord made it very clear to me what was to be done. We do not expect the people of the world to understand such things, for they will always be quick to assign their own reasons or to discount the divine process of revelation. Of course, people do. They'll say, well, of course you did it because you were under social pressure. Of course you did it because of this. Of course, we don't live in a vacuum. Of course, the questions get asked because the church is spreading to places like Africa and Brazil. At the same time, he is saying, in no uncertain terms, that revelation came because it was a revelation from God, not because it just was handy at the time. Bruce R. McConkie, I included this statement for you to read because Bruce R. McConkie was one of those who he tried to articulate definitive answers for every question people had in the gospel, especially in his very famous book, Mormon Doctrine. He wanted to give an answer for everything. In some cases, giving a definitive answer, he went beyond what Revelation gave as a definitive answer. It's important to note that he wrote that book before he was an apostle, though it was reprinted multiple times when he was an apostle. And he made some really definitive statements. I mean, you might recall that, for instance, he attributed the great and abominable church, called it the Catholic Church in the first edition of Mormon Doctrine, received some chastisement for that and removed that from it. But he was one who definitively stated the causes for the priesthood ban, stating, well, it's because of the curse of Ham. You can read it right there in the Bible. You see it also in the Pearl of Great Price, referring to the seed of Pharaoh, and so he believed that was the answer to why the ban existed. So after the ban was lifted, there were many people who came to him saying, now wait a minute, I thought you said the ban would never be lifted. I thought you said, and this is part of what he stated. There are statements in our literature by the early brethren that we have interpreted to mean that Negroes would not receive the priesthood immortality. By the way, they're using the term Negroes, which I know is a very, to you today, it's an insulting word. It's a racist word. You have to understand that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this was perceived as being the appropriate word. One of the interesting things about lexicon is that words that you think you are using to be deferential to someone today can end up being a bigoted word tomorrow. There are words you use right now that your great-grandchildren will think that you're a bigot because you use them. There are. You can already see this kind of evolution happening with the word handicapped, right? There are people saying they want the term to be handy-capable or disabled or something else like that. This once was the appropriate, respectful term when addressing someone who was black. I'm no different from this. I mean, my mom was, she was a hardcore, dyed in the wool Democrat when she was at BYU, and a believer in Martin Luther King, and so someone who actually cared about and marched in civil rights, demonstrations and rallies. And the term she had come to use was Negro, that was the respectful term. And that's what stuck with her. So even today, occasionally, I've worked with her a lot, honestly, but even today, occasionally, my mom will say, like, now, yeah, he was that Negro fellow who, and I'm like, Mom, we don't, no Negro, no, yeah, you know what I mean? And so the funny part is, here is me, in some ways, judging my mom by that term, that she needs to update her lexicon when she did more, to fight for civil rights than I ever did, right? I mean, that's just how the progress of history works. So try not to get hung up on phrases. I'm using the actual documents here so you can read them. I'm not editing them so that they come across nicer today, right? This would not have been seen as disrespectful in 1981. It is often seen as disrespectful by people today, and you can't conflate the two. That they would not have the priesthood immortality. I have said the same thing, and people write me letters and say, you said such and such. How is it now that we do such and such? And all I can say is it's time for disbelieving people to repent and got in line and believed in a living, modern prophet. Forget everything I have said, or what President Brigham Young said, or President George Buchanan said, or whosoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding, and without the light and knowledge that has now come into the world. We get our truth and our light, line upon line and precept upon precept. We have now added a new flood of intelligence and light on this particular subject, and it erases all the darkness and all the views and all the thoughts of the past. They don't matter anymore. It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before this first day of June 1978. It is a new day and a new arrangement, and the Lord has now given the revelation that sheds light out into the world on this subject. Despite that, you will still find people erroneously believing that the curse of Cain is the reason why blacks couldn't hold the priesthood. As the church's statement says, we don't know. We have no clear indication on really the origin of this practice when it began. Here's what we do know, that God through revelation ended it. When the question becomes, as the question is all on the tip of our tongues, why did it take God so long to end the priesthood ban? And I can give you a hearty, I don't know. I don't know. Of course I wish the ban had been ended sooner. I don't know why it took so long. But once we start asking questions like, why did it take so long? There's suddenly lots of questions we can ask. Think of the children of Israel. They're in bondage in Egypt for 400 years. 400 years. The people of God, the chosen people of God, born, live, die as slaves. Abused, maltreated, worked every day of their life. Like 100 years wasn't enough? Or 120 years, 130? But for 400 years? I don't know why God didn't call on Moses to lead them out of Egypt earlier. I don't know. I do know that God does have his timing for things. And maybe he waited until we were able to receive and accept that revelation. There's still people who hold racist views in the church even today, even now in our enlightened era. And it doesn't matter how often the prophets say, you need to not have racist views. And you know this. All of you know someone who has racist views. Even though you have a prophet of God saying you need to look at everyone as children of God, you'll still hear members of the church make sometimes racial comments. And not necessarily around black members of the church. When I was in Colorado, there was a woman in my ward who refused to take the sacrament from my best friend in that ward who was black. He was from South Carolina. He was there working in the oil fields same time I was doing my PhD. And it was amazing. She wouldn't take the sacrament when he was passing the sacrament from him. Now, I don't know what her particular issue is and whatever justification she might have assigned to it. What I know is the church has said we unequivocally condemn racism, both past and present. Does that mean that there were people in our church previously who held what we would consider racist views? Yes. Yes, that's what that means. Even Joseph Smith's position on slavery. Because he wasn't calling for the immediate emancipation of slaves, the government just freeing them all, could be criticized by people today. Joseph instead argued, well, of course, people aren't going to allow you to just free the slaves, but what if the federal government bought all of the slaves? You can't take their property away legally, but what if the federal government just purchased all of the slaves and then after purchasing them, then set them free? That would be deemed not an okay position in today's world. No, you should have said slavery should have ended immediately. But he's hated and considered an abolitionist radical for saying it. I sometimes in my history classes, I can't do it with you, obviously we're not together, I will introduce this era of the Civil War by telling them I want to give you an idea of how some people thought about blacks in America generally. And I tell them, look, there's one of the more powerful statesmen in the South is going to make an argument, a very racist argument, where he's going to say that essentially there are very few blacks that are intelligent enough to be able to do anything, certainly not vote. I suppose that maybe a very few blacks are intelligent enough that they could have the right to vote. And as the students sit there and contemplate that idea that, man, what a racist Southerner these people are, these slave owners, of course they thought that, I then let them know that actually it's not a Southern politician. It's actually Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, at near the end of the Civil War, in a public speech, broaches the subject of black men getting the right to vote negatively by saying, maybe there might be a few that might be considered intelligent enough to vote. And that thought is so radical for his day that, to us, most racist thing we've ever heard. If there was someone on TV just saying, well, I suppose only the intelligent black people can vote. I mean, we would hate that person, and justifiably so. But when we take our indignation and we try to transplant it back on Abraham Lincoln, there's a real problem. Because what he's saying and suggesting that any black man could vote could be the equal of a white man. That idea is so radical that, in fact, in the audience of that speech is John Wilkes Booth, who writes in his journal, that is the last speech that man will ever give. And on the basis of Lincoln's progressive racial ideologies, the same ideologies that to us we would say are ridiculously racist, the basis of his progressive racial ideologies, John Wilkes Booth will shortly thereafter murder Abraham Lincoln. So again, as I talked about, when we view the past through our own current lens, it's important so that we recognize the injustices of the past. Women are treated horribly. They are abused and beaten and assaulted and very little legal recourse. And those women who go through that, they suffer. I'm not going to argue they don't suffer. Slaves suffer. They are treated horribly. Only white men of property are given any real privilege in America at all throughout the 19th century and the 18th century and early 20th century. We are not yet 100 years removed from women having the right to vote in America. We're almost at the anniversary of it. That's how recent some of this is. So, of course, there have been vast, great injustices that have happened. So you can view history and look at these injustices and say, look at what these African saints suffered, not having the ability to go to the temple or to have the priesthood the way that we would. But at the same time, use a little bit of understanding that your current racial viewpoint, it wasn't theirs. And that while we can use our current viewpoint to understand why what happened in the past was wrong, we also can't expect Joseph Smith to understand racial science the way we do. We just can't. And if we do, again, we'll pat ourselves on the back, we'll make ourselves feel good, but we won't get any closer to what the truth is. We'll just make ourselves feel good. And if you study the past just to make yourself feel good because you're infinitely smarter and infinitely more, less biased than anyone in the past, well, that's great. You can pat yourself on the back a lot, but you won't really have an understanding. You'll be like every person watching, a show depicting abolitionists, a movie depicting abolitionists in the 1850s and 60s, and you'll say to yourself, if I lived back then, I would have been an abolitionist. Well, of course you would if you were a 21st century American and got in a time machine and went back there. But what if all you'd ever been taught from the time you were younger, both religiously, socially, and scientifically, was there was a racial difference? There's very little to compare it to. The general trend in America today on the practice of abortion is that abortion is, most Americans consider themselves pro-life. For a long time, most Americans consider themselves pro-choice, but more and more Americans, a majority of Americans identify themselves as pro-life. Nevertheless, abortion is still legal. Hypothetically, let's say that trend continues, that more and more Americans consider themselves pro-life, until eventually abortion is completely outlawed in the United States again. Think for a moment what the arguments of those people who endorsed choice, who argued for the idea of choice, what will those people look like to a generation 100 years removed from them? They'll look like bigots, they'll look like horrible people, they'll look terrible, even though in the society you live in, someone saying that they're pro-choice is generally an accepted understanding. Even if you don't agree, you're not horrified by the idea that someone is pro-choice. Not some people are, but in America generally, the understanding of that is something that is culturally responsive. So you gotta keep that in mind a little bit here. Immediately after the ban is lifted, church missionary work in Africa, in South America, it explodes. As now you can have local priesthood leaders. I'm not saying it removes all racism. There's absolutely racism, as people have to be taught to embrace God's children the way they should. But the church tries to give the priesthood as quickly as they can to black members of the church. I'm now going to play. I don't know how well the audio will go here. I want to play a few of these clips. In fact, probably what I'll do is, in fact, rather than play them, maybe what I'll do is I'll post them on to the Learning Suite so you can watch and go through them. And it's actual black members of the church talking about how they dealt with this. The reality is there were black men and women who joined the church knowing that they couldn't have the priesthood. Talk about faith of these men and women who what they saw was a bigoted decision in the church, a barring of them from having the priesthood. And yet, to them, it wasn't a disqualifier of faith. In this first clip, you have Darius Gray and several other gentlemen talking about the fact that they couldn't have the priesthood and what a change it was when they could. As difficult as the concept is, and hopefully after you watch these videos on Learning Suite, you'll have a little bit different perspective as you think about this. I know this is one of the more difficult things for us to accept and understand in our day. It's one of the more difficult ones for me. I desperately wish there was never a priesthood ban. I wish it with all my heart. At the same time, in the same way that we could not judge women who sacrificed to live plural marriage when they were commanded to, that wasn't a disqualifier for them. They believed Joseph Smith was a prophet in spite of plural marriage. There are many hundreds, thousands of black men and women who are members of the church prior to the restriction of the lifting of the restriction of the priesthood and temple ban, who are certain that the church is true. So if you have feelings of discomfort that many of us have when you think about this, and you start to think to yourself, I don't know, maybe the church isn't true because of that, remember that there are black men and women who actually were affected by the ban, who actually do have to live with the legacy of racism. Whereas for many of us, not all of us are the same race, but for many of you watching, most of you are white, you aren't actually experiencing the racism, right? It's not actually affecting you. It's just so harmful to think about what it would be like if it affected your brothers and sisters. But there are many thousands of black men and women who were members of the church who had such faith, who knew the Book of Mormon was so true, that even in the face of this policy that had a racial distinction that prevented them from going to the temple, even in the face of that, they knew this was God's true church. So that demonstrates to me it is not a necessary reaction to the priesthood ban that someone needs to lose their testimony and leave the church. Because the people who were affected most by it are still certain that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young are prophets of God. Still certain that God blesses and leads this church. Are there reasons we don't understand? Yes. I don't know that that'll ever be clear until after this life. As a historian, I wish I had more documents. I wish I could pinpoint the day that I know that this is when we started, and I just don't have it. But I do know that this is God's true church. And maybe I'll just close off the class talking about this. In your lives, you will always have people that will attack the church, either directly or maybe indirectly, raising questions about things. Well, why does the church this, or why does the church that? Why don't they believe this, or why did they ever do this? Why did they practice polygamy? Why was there a priesthood ban? Many of them will claim that they have knowledge that you don't have. Well, if you knew what I knew about Brigham Young, you wouldn't be a member. Or if you knew what I knew about Joseph Smith, you wouldn't be a member of the church. I've heard that. In fact, when I go and I give firesides, there are people all the time who say to me, are there ever things that you studied when you were up at the church history library, secret things that you read a document that made you think maybe Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet? I can say unequivocally it's the exact opposite. The more you actually studied every letter, every minute of every meeting, every diary and journal entry, every sermon that he gave, the more resoundingly the Spirit testified that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Did you see his foibles? Did you see him as a man? Sure. You saw times where he lost his temper, where he was in a disagreement that he wishes he wasn't in. I mean, that he was a man and flawed and broken like all of us. I mean, think back even when he got the plates. His initial reaction, even after having met with the angel, when he saw the plates, was to take the plates and sell them for money. Because his family was poor. He had the same reaction that was natural to most people. So Joseph wasn't perfect. None of the prophets are perfect. And all of them were subject to the culture in which they grew up and they lived. Cultures which sometimes we look back on now and we say, well, that doesn't seem appropriate, that doesn't seem appropriate. But despite the fact that he was a man and that he was flawed, I can testify unequivocally that I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Having read everything, all 10,000 documents produced by Joseph Smith in his life, every letter he ever wrote or received, every sermon he ever gave that we have record of, every revelation, published or unpublished, canonized or not, I can say I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. And that when you meet that person who says, well, if you only knew what I knew, I don't know who you're talking to, but I can almost guarantee that they haven't studied as much about Joseph Smith as I have. It's not because I'm special or I'm smart. I'm neither of those things. It's because it was my job for a decade. And so I read those things. It was my job. But you don't have to have all of those experiences. You don't have to read every single thing Joseph ever wrote to know that he's a prophet of God. All you really have to do is ask God. Because the reason why I know Joseph Smith's a prophet and that the Doctrine and Covenants, these revelations collected by him, that they are literally the commandments of God and that Jesus is coming again, the reason I know those things is not because of the things I've read. I know them because God has told me those things. So I bear you my testimony that this is God's true church. Are there things we don't understand? Yes. Are there things that are difficult? Yes. Do we believe God will reveal other things? Yes. But I also know that Joseph Smith absolutely is a prophet of God. That he saw God in Jesus and that he received revelation for us all. I bear you my testimony of that, and I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.